Hi, Samir. Nice to see you here tonight.
Hi, Maryam. Thanks very much for having me on.
Uh, I have to say I really enjoyed your book here, which is also you can see it like this. And what I really liked about your book is it is deeply personal and it is open and honest, but still philosophical. And I really like to keep that for the later part of this conversation, because when you open your first chapter with profoundly sharing your profound experience of loss, I really found it resonating with my own experiences, and this is very important for me that we will talk about it later. But as many other philosophical settings, we need to first define our concepts and what the philosophers do at this situation. So I would like first to go to the definition of anxiety. It is such a elusive concept. Some would mix it and confuse it with fear, phobia, being worried, and other being stressed. But what about that feeling? You feel that something bad going to happen, but you cannot put your finger on it. What is that feeling?
Thanks, Maryam. I think that's a good way of starting the discussion. And I should say right at the very outset that we're probably not going to get definitional precision in perhaps the way the more exacting amongst us might desire. But I think there's one preliminary definition we can start with, which is to distinguish it from fear, which is that fear is said to have a concrete object, and anxiety doesn't seem to have a concrete object. Perhaps by further reflection, we might make this non-object or this nothingness become a concrete object and transform our anxiety into fear. But I would say at the outset, and this is a definition you can find in Freud, this is a definition you can find in Kierkegaard as well, that anxiety is a sort of a formless fear. It's a fear of something that we don't quite know or recognize or understand. I sometimes even like to call it anticipatory fear. That is, I can foresee a future terrible eventuality taking place. I know that at some level I will react adversely to that terrible eventuality, and I anticipate the fear that I feel at that moment. So that eventuality has not been realized yet. It lies in the realm of possibility. So in that sense, it is not concrete. And I anticipate the fear that I will feel at that moment. So in some ways, I also think of anxiety as the fear of being fearful, that I will feel fear at a particular point in the past, and I start to anticipate that fear, and that makes me anxious. So I think this is a good preliminary working definition. Anxiety is a fear that doesn't have a concrete object. It further resolves into, I think, several other kinds of anxieties. And I think there are, I would say, 3 or 4 shades to it, which I try to isolate in my book. One is that I think the anxiety that arises from our existential conditions, and I can talk about those. The other is a fear of death, which I would call a kind of basement dwelling anxiety, which is sort of always present, lurking away in the subterranean recesses of our mind, and which rises up, bubbles up to the surface, and takes concrete form in rather more mundane anxieties. And the third kind of anxiety, or the third most, I would say, prominent form of anxiety, something that you find in psychoanalysis, in Freudian psychoanalysis, it is the signature of inner conflict, but most fundamentally, it turns out to be the fear of the repetition of a loss of love, or even more basically, just the fear of loss of love, right? We haven't lost this love yet, but we might lose it. And that possibility is one that makes us anxious. So let me stop there for a second. I would like to say something more about the existential conditions that make anxiety almost inevitable, if you will, and I will I will proceed
Yeah,
with
we
that.
will go back. Yeah, we will go back to that yeah, later with this
Sure.
question, because I had a follow-up question. How
Mhm.
you distinguish, it assumes, but you don't define in the book, distinguish between clinical anxiety and what we could call existential or philosophical anxiety. Is it a fair thing to say?
You know, I would say that I'm not sure that there's a sharp dividing line that can be drawn between whatever we call clinical anxiety and what I call existential anxiety. I think what I would call existential anxiety is in some ways a kind of constitutive condition of a creature that has certain conditions attached to its existence. So for human beings, those conditions are the fact that we are in time, the fact that we are conscious of this time. You know, for example, we might be creatures that lived in time, but were not conscious of the passage of time. And thirdly, that this time is finite, right? So we live in time, the time is finite, we are conscious that this time is finite. And I would add two other further conditions. One is that we are curious about the future, right? We are concerned about the future. We are curious about the future. And I think this is a kind of a linkage that anxiety has with inquiry and philosophical inquiry in particular. And the last condition I would say is that we're curious about the future, but we are incapacitated with respect to the future. So we are these creatures who know that time is running out. We want to know what lies in the future, but we are not in a position to be able to modify or change the future as much as we would like. This puts us in a very peculiar sort of nexus. We want to know, but we cannot know. You know, for example, I might be conscious that this time is finite and yet be completely unconcerned about what happens to me in the future. If I was that kind of creature, I wouldn't be anxious, but that's not who we are. So I think once these conditions come together, we get existential anxiety. Now, I think the relationship of that to clinical anxiety, which I take it to be a term that we give to something that has been diagnosed, something that is understood as a kind of psychiatric or psychiatric disorder, that relationship, I would say, is one that I don't fully understand myself. It seems to me, however, that given these constitutive conditions of ours, that existential anxiety can take many different forms. And, you know, for example, I might have a high level fear, or I might even have an anxiety disorder. And, you know, when I use the word disorder, it has affected the functioning of my life. It has incapacitated me in some ways. I fail to meet some normative conditions for how I should be living my life or reasoning. That might be my particular existential anxiety manifesting itself, interacting with the material conditions of my life, with my particular life history in particular ways, and producing its own unique variant. So I would say there is a kind of existential anxiety that all human beings suffer from, but since every one of us is unique, every one of us has a unique, distinctive signature of our own, the anxiety that we suffer from is also distinctive and unique. No one's anxiety is quite like any other's, quite simply because none of us is like anybody else. You know, there's never been anybody quite like you in the history of the universe, and there never will be. So it stands to reason that your own particular flavor will be quite unique. The way you may be diagnosed in a clinic might be that basic anxiety playing itself out in your life in its own distinctive way.
Thank you. And another thing I appreciate about your book is that you approach the question of anxiety from different frameworks, from existentialist philosophy to critical theory, psychoanalysis, Marxism, and at some points. But you start with Buddhism. Which some might call it not philosophical enough, and they might say it is religious approach to just dealing and settling anxiety or overcome it, not to understanding it. But I found in that section very deep philosophical discussion about self. Can you elaborate on how the Buddhism of not having a self or continuous self relates to anxiety?
Thank you. So I would say to take up the second part of your query directly, there is a kind of central concept in Buddhism, which is called dukkha or duk, which is translated in many different ways. It's sometimes called dissatisfaction with existence, suffering, anguish, worry. Anxiety is one of the emotions that plays a role in this general dissatisfaction with existence. And if you remember the basic existential conditions that I mentioned, these were visible to the Buddha as well, right? That we human beings are aware of the fact that our time on this planet is running out. Moreover, we know that certain inevitable conditions of our life are going to obtain. We will grow old, we will age, we will lose the company of those we love, and we ultimately ourselves will die, right? This sort of central perplexity, I guess, which the Buddha set out to answer, for him, there were certain failures of knowledge that resulted in these feelings. And these failures of knowledge had to do with failures to realize conditions of our existence, the fact that the world is always eternally changing, that everything in the world is dependent upon everything else, and that, as you pointed out, a fundamental failure of knowledge is that we fail to come to realize that the self-identical, enduring through time self that we ascribe to ourselves, the I, the it, the ego that we ascribe to ourselves, this is not existent in the way that we take it to be. We take ourselves to be a kind of entity that endures through time, that acquires certain attributes called age, height, income, color, so on and so forth. And at the end of it, this entity runs out and dies, right? The Buddha offers us an analysis that suggests that there is no such enduring self underneath all of this, right? There are these 5 bundles, the skandhas, right? The consciousness, volition, sense, and so on, that these change, that the self as we think of it is actually the locus of these 5 processes dynamically evolving over time, but there is no one thing that endures through it. But if there isn't one thing that endures through it, then whose fortunes and misfortunes are we worried about, right? If we think about it, it is the self that stands to lose or gain honor in this world or be dishonored. That self is always the target of these fortunes that we imagine or these disasters that we imagine for ourselves. But if there is no such self, right, then in some sense, our worries, our suffering, is the result of a deep confusion in some sense about who we are. We haven't understood what we are, and that's why we are anxious, right? So I give the example in my book of someone who goes to see a movie, right? And when the credits start flashing up on the screen, our viewer refuses to leave the theater and starts crying and wailing because they want the movie to go on, right? And we have to tell him, the movie's up, the next show needs to begin, you need to clear out the theater. And you say, no, I want this thing to continue. You say, well, that's not how a movie works. Movies tend to be 3 hours long. You pay a certain price, and then you leave the theater. We would say this person needs to be educated on the concept of what a movie is so that they're not quite as distressed by the fact that this movie has run out. Now, of course, people claim to know that life is finite. They say, yes, I know I'll die someday. And again, the other analogy I give is, you perform an operation on someone's eyes, you take the bandage off and you ask them, can you see? And the person says, yes, I can see. And then they promptly walk into a table. You say, no, you don't quite see yet. And I think there's this sense, there's this relationship that we have to these claims that are made in Buddhism. We think they're obvious, we get it. We know we're going to die. Yes, I know this, but we're not really getting it. We're not really realizing the truth of the claim that there are no selves, that there is in some ways, this world is not constituted in the way we would like it to be. And this disjuncture between our beliefs about the world, our understanding of existence, and the way things really are, that's what causes this disjuncture. That's what causes this suffering of ours, right? The path to enlightenment in the Buddhist tradition is hard. It's very difficult. It's not easily realizable, which means that most of our life, we will be living with anxiety. So I think this is one slight subtle confusion that sometimes people have about Buddhism, that it is promising us deliverance from anxiety, so it regards anxiety as negative. That is true, but it also understands that we're not going to be free of it quite as quickly as we might want it to be. So we have to understand, or we have to find ways to live with it as well. The Eightfold Path can be understood not just as a path to deliverance, but also as a path to living with anxiety and navigating it.
That's path to enlightenment. Reminds me another part of your book that you mentioned, or if I'm not mistaken, on another paper you have written, that humans and more specifically philosophers are yearning for truth and certainty, and that is also another source of anxiety. And is that could be again cured, or just we are in the delusion of not curing and only understanding the anxiety? How can we combine these two?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. What I call a certain kind of epistemic anxiety, right? There's this desire for truth, a desire for certainty, a desire to be reassured that we can count upon something without any doubts about it whatsoever. I think if you look at Enlightenment philosophy, if you look at modern philosophy, I would say it's characterized by this kind of epistemic anxiety. There's a real desperation in some sense to make sure, perhaps it's the desire to give a rational basis for faith, right? What if I was mistaken about the object of my faith, right? What if there was some way in which the kind of certainty that I want for moral assurances is not forthcoming to me, right? Once I think you use this lens to look at some of the philosophical speculations of that period, you can see them being driven by a kind of what I would, frankly call a certain kind of anxiety that what if we were to get this wrong, right? What if the guidance that we seek for right action is actually incorrect, right? Now, I think there is a kind of antidote to that kind of anxiety, which I think 19th and 20th century philosophy have probably exposed us to. We have become disillusioned with the project of knowledge. We have become disillusioned with the idea that we might find certainty in any kind of empirical realm. We have reconciled ourselves to the idea that certainty belongs perhaps only to the realm of the formal and the deductive, and that human affairs as they are, and even science as it is not infected with the kind of certainty that we imagine is the best that we deserve, right? So I think there is a greater reconciliation with those uncertainties. And I think the kinds of philosophizing that we see in the 19th and 20th centuries, whether it's existentialism, whether it's pragmatism, whether it's post-analytic philosophy, I think these in some ways are characterized by a kind of acceptance that certainty, even in the epistemic realm, is not something that we will obtain. And we have to make do with, perhaps a contextualist epistemology, perhaps a pragmatist epistemology. Perhaps we have to elevate probabilistic reasoning to a more elevated status. I think these are in their own ways attempts to come to grips with the fact that that a certainty that we might have desired in a particular realm is not to be found, right?
And do you think existentialist philosophy, specifically people like Heidegger, could have had answered these problem of wanting certainty and anxiety outcome anxiety of it?
The way I approach Heidegger's writings on anxiety in my treatment of him is his consideration of anxiety as a kind of mood that reveals to us certain aspects of our existence, right? So there is a way in which, as I point out, Heidegger privileges moods over this exalted reason with a capital R. These moods are noetic. They give us knowledge. We should pay attention to them. And I think one of the things that the mood introduces us to is the contingent nature of all that we observe, right? These things that we take to be fixed and certain about us, these are actually the results of a series of contingencies that we have come to realize over a period of time. And anxiety is the mood that makes me realize the contingency of all of this, right? It's the mood that makes me realize that things that I might be taking as eternal, as somehow essential to me, that these are the product perhaps of historical circumstances. These are the products of agreements between human beings. These are perhaps these little rickety arrangements that we have made to prop up all that I see around me, right? So I look at myself. This is the example I give in the book. I inquire into who I am, right? And, am I my name? Am I defined by my relationships, right? This question of who am I, right? And I come to realize that there is a kind of veil of meaning that we have imposed over existence to make it comprehensible. And there is a mood that comes over me, and the veil of meaning lifts, and I'm sort of hit with being in its nakedness. If you remember Sartre's Nausea, right, there's this great moment when Quentin is in the garden and he looks at the roots of a tree, and he is nauseated because the roots of the tree are present to him in their naked being. There's no mediation on them, nothing that tells me that these are roots of a tree, that this is a biological entity, this is attached to a tree, their purpose is nourishment, right? All of a sudden, they're just existent. They don't even have shape in some sense, because shape is also a kind of contingent attribute that we have attached to existence, right? So in some sense, we come to realize that there is a man-made, contingently agreed upon veil of meaning that we have imposed upon existence. You and I and everyone else has agreed that we will call these things by their names. We will ascribe them functions. We will fit them into our daily lives. And the anxiety is the mood that makes me realize that all of this is hanging together by a series of contingent historical arrangements, and this could collapse. And there's a kind of nakedness that underwrites all of this. So moods like depersonalization or ego loss, these kinds of moods put us into contact with a certain kind of anxiety. I lose a handle. Who am I? What am I? What is all of this, right? When people have these depersonalized episodes, and we say they've suffered a psychotic breakdown and they need to be taken to a psychiatric hospital, there's a sense in which we have lost our handle on the connections between the various meanings that we make. That's a deeply anxiety-inducing feeling. I don't have that agreement that I normally rely upon to navigate my way through this world. That mood tells me that this is contingent and that I have a role to play in the maintenance of these meanings, right? That I can't just take this on. There's a sense in which I have to contribute to this. I have to continue to construct these meanings, right? And that's up to me. I think that's where the existentialist flavor comes up, right? But it's the mood that puts me into contact with the nakedness that underlies these veils of meaning that we as human beings have imposed upon being.
Great. So we sort of covered the sources of anxiety. But the key theme in your book is the idea of acceptance, that we, in dealing with anxiety or understanding it or living, we have to live with our anxieties. But this prescription may be seen as offensive to someone who has acute kind of clinical anxiety. If I say to my friend who suffers from severe social anxiety, that anxiety is being human is anxiety, as you write, and anxiety is being human, they would just say, what are you talking about? I am suffering and I want to get rid of this anxiety. I cannot live with it. So what is your answer to this sort of objection?
Right. The state or the states you describe, I think those kinds of states are states where the kind of relief that people are seeking, and sometimes we might seek it out through pharmaceutical medication or through a variety of other. I think my response to that is that even if I'm clinically anxious or I am disordered, as you might say, I'm suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, and I take medication for it, right? It might put me in a state where I am able to reason more about anxiety, right? And I think even if I was to deliver myself from a kind of anxiety that has made me dysfunctional, for instance, right? I would say, I say this in the beginning of my book. I said the considerations I present in this book are only available to those, that are capable of thinking through this anxiety in this fashion. And I think an important step in realizing that is that even if I was to take medication even if I was to say, deliver myself from all those material afflictions that cause me anxious. I can imagine someone saying to me, yeah, well, I'm overworked. I've got 15 bills to pay, and I'm really, really overworked and tired and stressed out, and I'm really anxious about my future prospects. And you want me to just live with this anxiety? Yeah. I think the response there is that I think even if all those conditions were met, even if we had all our material conditions realized, even if we had perfect relationships in our life, even if we were to deliver ourselves from the most horrible moments of our anxiety disorders through medication, we would still have to think through the existential implications of the fact that our lives are finite, that we will die, that tasks will remain unfulfilled, and moreover, that we will suffer losses from now on till the day we die. Nothing, no anxiety medication will prevent a steady stream of messages from now on till the end of my life informing me that family members and friends are passing away as we get older. I like to say Jeff Bezos can have $70 billion in the bank. He might be able to cryogenically preserve himself to try and ward off death, but he's not going to be able to save himself from the misfortunes that he knows are his inevitable lot as a human being. Not from the deaths of his schoolmates or from the deaths of those he loves. And I don't think Jeff will ever stop fearing the loss of love either. I think those kinds of insecurities, those kinds of fears, I think those are the ones that I'm talking about. That no matter what are circumstances above that, whether I'm taking medication, whether I'm materially well off, whether I am in some ways perfectly in tune with my environment, I found a functional harmony in my relationships. With all that done, I think I will still continue to be concerned about my fate. I will still continue to be concerned about what will happen to me. And I will still perhaps grieve the loss of those who are the ones that I love in my life. I think those kinds of anxieties and fears, those seem to me part of our human lot. And I'm not sure that anything other than changing the conditions of our existence can actually affect those fundamental anxieties. So I have a lot of
So,
sympathy. I should just really quickly say the condition you present, I'm sympathetic to that. I'm just talking about a much lower level that will remain regardless of how we medicate ourselves or change our material conditions.
so we can go back to the definition we had at the beginning, that we distinguish clinical and existential anxiety. And in your book, you're mostly talking about existential and philosophical kind of anxiety.
Yes,
That
yes.
when we...
And the relationship made between the two, that our clinical anxiety or our anxiety disorder, as we have been diagnosed, is perhaps our distinctive anxiety. It's mine, the one realized in my life, with the intersection of the particulars of my particular life with these basic conditions. So I'm born destined to be anxious. Perhaps I'm born anxious, as many thinkers have described us as being born traumatized, so to speak, right? Torn from the womb and thrust into this world. But once I'm in this world, I'm interacting with the history of this world. I start generating my own history. These combinations of who I am, right, or in some ways the basic parameters of my life, these start to interact. My life starts to come about. That life has its own distinctive anxiety. It might be exacerbated by all sorts of conditions, leading to particular flowerings or particular occurrences of anxiety in our life that require many different kinds of resolution and treatment. So I would say, for example, in my case, the particular personal losses in my life, they led to a very distinctive kind of anxiety in my life. And when I spent 5 years in the therapy clinic, what I realized was that I'd always been an anxious person, but these losses had produced my distinctive species of anxiety. The anxiety that I suffer from is very, very peculiar and particular to me. And it's because I've lived the life that I have.
So you were, before your experiences, you were an anxious person as Samir Chopra or as a general human being? Which was it? I mean, is it all of us are anxious, or only you as your particular person, you were anxious?
I think therapy taught me that. I think because I came to understand my life a little better, the life that I'd lived, I think I came to understand that I'd always been anxious. And I think the study of philosophy, which was actually proceeding in tandem at the time. I would go to philosophy seminars in the morning and sometimes go to therapy in the afternoon. I think studying philosophy made me realize that in some ways these conditions of existence, since they were universal, this in some ways reassured me that everyone was anxious. And I call that a reassurance because one of the most terrible things about suffering is that you're convinced that you're suffering alone. And I think there was something reassuring about the fact that I hadn't been marked out for the universe for a special kind of loss. There wasn't, in some sense, some malevolent searchlight that was seeking me out and punishing me in its own particular way. I was suffering misfortunes that could have been mine or that could have been anybody else's. They happened to occur in my life, but that didn't mean there was anything special about mine. In that sense, I hadn't been picked out by the universe. I realized that in some sense, everyone at some level was suffering in this way, even if some of us disguised it, particularly better than others. A lot of my friends didn't think I was anxious at the time, for instance, right?
Going back to the prescribing acceptance, some philosophers, specifically you mentioned critical theorists and Marxists, would say that encouraging people to accept their anxious conditions brings us social and political problems because it's promoting social conformism, and you ask them to not ask them directly, but the consequences they won't go against social injustices and oppression. What is their response to this objection?
Yeah, in my chapter on Marcuse and Marx, I bring up this critique specifically as Marcuse was very critical of Sartre's views on existentialism. Precisely this critique, as you mentioned it, that in some ways we might be preaching a certain sort of acquiescence and complacency by asking people to take what is a man-made condition and treat it as an ontological condition of existence, right? There is a kind of danger there, and that danger is precisely the one you mentioned. And in that sense, Marcuse and Marx are exactly correct, right? The fact that we are bound to be anxious in some existential sense should actually lead us to be more active in saying, I would not like our material conditions to aggravate the basic anxieties that we already have. So this calls for activism. This calls for a certain kind of engagement with the world, which is to say that I might be bound to be anxious. And in fact, I would say a creature that is bound to be anxious as a condition of its existence should be especially interested in ordering a world that does not make it more anxious than it needs to be, right? So I would say that the lesson I get out of critical theory is that we should not be complacent about the way in which we organize the world. We should not accept the ordering of the world as it is if we find that features of it make it anxious, but we should do this with eyes open, knowing that what we are doing is carrying out a form of politics. We are working for our community. We're trying to make the world a better one for our family, for ourselves. But none of this is it might in some ways free us to have more time to reflect on our existential condition, right? There's a kind of unconscious haze which the conditions of modern society expect us to navigate, that we should just get up in the morning, punch the clock, get to work. And this kind of absorption in work is its own deliverance from anxiety. But I think what critical theory asks us to do is to push back on that, is to investigate critically the ways in which we have ordered and arranged the world around us. So I think my note in that chapter is precisely an activist one. We shouldn't be acquiescent. We shouldn't be complacent. We should look into the ways that the world's material conditions are making what our basic lot in life is worse than it needs to be.
Great. And you mentioned yourself when you did therapy for your losses, you went also to the philosophical philosophy lectures. I want to ask, which one helped you at the end? This is a personal and philosophical question. Did philosophy help you for overcoming your anxiety caused by losses, or only therapy?
That's a good question. I think I began my PhD a few months after my mother passed away. So when I began my PhD, I was in the process of grieving for her, and of course, her loss had been especially grievous because it was a kind of, as I called it, a kind of double hammer blow because of the loss of my father when I'd been a teenager. So I think, and in those days, I found my early days in philosophy terribly alienating. I was studying an analytic philosophy department, the City University Graduate Center in the 1990s. Everybody studied philosophy of language, epistemology, logic, philosophy of mind. That's all we did. We were quite an ahistorical department. Continental philosophy was marginalized. So I did a lot of technical material in college. My my PhD dissertation was on formal normative epistemology, but I think my reading, I often found philosophical analysis or reading or the discussions I had with my classmates to be of some kind of deliverance. I think these traditions that I mentioned in the book, they were not traditions that I took classes in. I didn't take a class in Buddhism. I didn't take a class in existentialism. I certainly did not take a class on Heidegger. I did not take classes on Marcuse and Marx. These are all people that I discovered on my own because sometimes they were dismissed by the analytical tradition. And I was curious as to why these folks were dismissed in quite the way that they were. I had come to philosophy because I had come to it via reading existentialist literature and reading some other material that was related. In my first social and political philosophy class, I read some Marxist theory. I read Marx. I read Sidney Hook. On Marx, these are these very elementary introductions to this material, but I was already finding them useful in thinking through some of the feelings I had about who I was in this world. I even found great literature very useful. I found the writings of African American writers very helpful in thinking through some of my predicaments and how I felt about myself. So I would say there was a complex set of sources that influenced how I thought about philosophy, how philosophy could help me. And I think as my teaching in philosophy progressed, as I taught a wider spectrum of classes and actually encountered different philosophical traditions and engaged in discussions with my students in my seminars, in office hours, and I worked through texts with them, that I think I came to actually find some of the quote unquote deliverance or relief that I was looking for. So I wouldn't say that all the philosophy I studied was equally helpful to me. I don't think philosophy of language, for instance, was particularly helpful to me. But I do think, many of the other traditions that I did were.
Yeah, we passed the time, and I shouldn't be greedy asking my question. Just briefly, I want to ask the last question, because you are now acting, you are not in academic philosophy anymore, and you are doing philosophical counseling. Could you briefly say to our audience what is the philosophical counseling, which has been a trend in recent years?
Great. First of all, I didn't realize it was a trend, but I'm glad to hear that it is. So quick introduction. One way to introduce this is to say something like, well, if you look at the etymology of the term psychotherapy, psyche for soul, therapia for healing. So psychotherapy means soul healing, which is, of course, the term that philosophers use to describe themselves in many ancient traditions, right? You can find this in ancient Greek philosophy. The Buddha himself is referred to as a great healer. And that was the original promise of philosophy, that by reflecting on ourselves and our life, this would enable us to lead a better life. Now, what, of course, better means in that context is something that we need to think about. But I would say that philosophy was meant to be a resource that was helping us to find some consonance between us and existence, right? To, as it were, patch up ourselves to bring us into harmony with the cosmos. So reflection, rationality, reason, right? These exalted words that we have. But I would say there's the basic notion behind philosophical counseling right now is that we are seeking certain kinds of useful self-transparencies or self-awareness. We want an investigation of the beliefs and values by which we live our lives by. We want an understanding of who we are, right? And one way to do that is to engage in a kind of investigation of it. Hopefully, and here's where the counselor comes in with a guide, with a sympathetic, informed guide, perhaps one that asks the right questions, that prompts the right self-awareness on our part, and that hopefully helps us resolve conflicts that might be bothering us, that helps us exercise agency and choice to help us think through these problems. So I would say philosophical counseling is psychotherapy in the sense that psychotherapy is a kind of philosophical counseling. We are helping people obtain greater self-awareness of themselves. And I would say, if you look at all the modern psychotherapeutic traditions, they start with philosophical foundations and they start with a theory of the person, right? Psychoanalysis has a theory of the tripartite mind. It understands mental disorders as resulting from inner psychic conflict. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is quite explicitly based upon Stoicism in some ways, right? That there are chains of reasoning. We need to throw spanners in the reasoning that leads to problems. These are all, I would say, arguably quite explicitly philosophical methods that have found their way into these psychotherapeutic modalities. Freud himself was famously influenced by Schopenhauer and by Nietzsche with his theory of the unconscious. And that's a very explicit foundation. That's a very explicit philosophical foundation for a psychotherapeutic tradition. So I would say in philosophical counseling, what we're really doing is returning philosophy to what it was always supposed to be, before it became this, highly academic, professionalized discipline, which is sort of a 19th century artifact. Before the modern university with its departments came about, there wasn't such a thing as a professional philosopher. And I think once philosophy became an academic discipline, psychology came on the scene, and psychology with its empirical components. But all of these psychotherapeutic traditions, and clinical psychology included, they rely on models of the person. Philosophy has a model of the person as well. There's the model person, there's the metaphysical person. These notions of the person help us understand who we are and why we might be facing the problems that we are facing. And the reflections that philosophers have offered us on the human condition, these are useful to us for thinking through our condition and thinking through ways in which we might come to live with ourselves. Probably the hardest challenge of all, accepting ourselves and coming to understand who we are and continuing to live with ourselves. I think in that sense, philosophy has a role to play. And it's a field that philosophy should never have vacated. And philosophical counseling, I think, is just an attempt to return philosophy to its rightful position as soul healers, which was what philosophy was supposed to be. Not just, kind of a degree that you do before you go to law school, for instance, right?
Thank you. So I'm turning to questions from the audience. Shiristi asks, if as a human being, all of us are bound to suffer from philosophical anxiety, what makes it unique? I understand everyone experiences differently, but are they comparable in any way? Are there any levels to it? How do we compare the magnitude of our anxieties?
So I think if I've understood the question correctly, we have what I would call the basic existential anxiety that I'm describing. And that condition of us, that condition of existence of ours interacts with our particular life. So that's where the uniqueness of our anxiety comes in, because we are born into unique socioeconomic, historical, cultural circumstances, right? So once I'm born, I am a human person that is aware of the finiteness of its life and aware of, in some ways, its existential parameters. But given that, now I interact with the fact that I'm born into a particular socioeconomic class. I'm born into a particular historical nexus. These I must navigate with my existential awareness upon me, right? So when I go into the clinic, for instance, and I say that I'm fearful of X, Y, and Z, and my interlocutor asks, why in particular are you fearful about X, Y, and Z? That investigation reveals a particular way in which my fundamental anxieties have found expression in my life. So I don't think there is a way to compare magnitudes of anxiety. The phenomenology of anxiety varies across its sufferers. And as Nietzsche famously said, whatever we have words for is already dead in our hearts. So my attempt to describe these particular features of my anxiety are, I'm only going to have limited success with that. But what we can do perhaps is compare notes on what kinds of things make us anxious. Sometimes we find commonality there. I think parents can all agree that the fates of their children make them particularly anxious, and so on and so forth, right? How it is manifesting in our life, I think, makes us in some ways lonely sufferers. But I think we can be reassured by the fact that no one is escaping the clutches of this particular creature. They are suffering from it in their own particular ways and making it visible in their lives in their own particular ways.
Thanks. Jake asks for some examples to how someone would learn to live with anxiety.
Very good. One, I think, is I think learning to live with anxiety means, first of all, that I think it's kind of acceptance in realizing that this is going to be ever present. So, for example, we learn to navigate. There are certain triggers for my anxiety that exacerbate it, right? I learn how to navigate those, whether those are conditions to be avoided, conditions to be sought out. I also think that there are attempts to bring about greater self-knowledge through that anxiety. So sometimes when I'm feeling anxious, I don't immediately try to push the anxiety away. As Paul Tillich says, one of the best things that we can do with anxiety is to actually think about the anxiety and to try to make the anxiety into a fear. Try to give it a concrete object, for instance, right? So sometimes a kind of meditation on the anxiety, and this and I mean by this not just, for example, sitting in a mindfulness session, but actually thinking about what might be making me anxious, as opposed to trying to run away from it immediately, right? This is the unpleasant task, but I think in some ways it's almost necessary if we are to use anxiety as a source of self-knowledge. Anxiety can sometimes remind us of the values that we wish to live by, because our failure to live by them can make us anxious. And we might want to investigate the values that we have chosen for ourselves. Living with anxiety can make us investigate the kinds of lives we have lived thus far, whether they in some ways meet the conditions that we have imposed upon ourselves, but to even investigate where those conditions have come from. So I think when I say living with anxiety, I'm actually making a certain invitation to engage in species of self-inquiry that might help me understand why I am anxious in the way that I am. If I find that I'm anxious in particular circumstances and particular settings, then there is a particular relationship I have to those circumstances and settings that is worthy of my investigation as a kind of gateway to self-knowledge, right? So I think, when I say living with anxiety, I think, first of all, I think it's an attitude towards my anxiety, that this is something that is going to be an ever-present feature of my life. I think I gave this example earlier in my talk that, either there is escape, activism, or acceptance. So either I escape my anxiety, I change it by, in some ways medicating it, or if I accept it, then perhaps it's not the problem that it was before. A problem is something that I'm trying to solve. I'm either succeeding at it or I'm failing at it. But if it's something that's going to be ever present, then I don't have the relationship of success or failure with respect to its removal anymore. Then I need to have a relationship of reconstrual with respect to it. So perhaps one of the things I have to do is to stop thinking of it as inherently undesirable.
And thank you. Another related question from Hung says, what exactly is better off about a person who accepts than a person who doesn't accept, since existential anxiety is not eliminated in either way? What is the difference?
I think the difference is, think about this from the perspective of someone that has been told that the purpose of their life is to live a happy life. And at any given moment, I am either succeeding in being happy or failing at being happy. But suppose I was told that the purpose of life is not to be happy, but to live life and to accept it with difficulties, uncertainties, problems, and perplexities included in it, right? With all its, then my life isn't a matter of succeeding or failing at being happy or not happy, because I am in some ways much more accepting of the fact that this is a state that I will confront. So I think when I think of someone that has accepted their existential anxiety, they've accepted its place in their life, the best description I can give of that state is a certain kind of reconciliation, that this is my lot, so to speak. But I think that's not an innocent reconciliation, because I think in the act of accepting the presence of anxiety in our lives, we might be changing the very identity of this thing, right? Because when I reconceptualize or re-understand something, there is a way in which that entity isn't the same thing that it was before, right? That entity acquired its identity conditions by the way that I understood it previously. If I've understood this as something I'm not trying to get rid of, it's not the same thing it was before.
Thanks. Christina asks about the idea of authenticity in continental tradition about anxiety. She wants some more elaboration on this. Do we become more authentic as we overcome anxiety? Do you think these concepts shouldn't link?
Yeah, authenticity is a very interesting concept in existentialism. I would say one way to think about it is that there is, and I think this is of particular, I think, importance to us or to all of us that are growing up under the weight of certain kinds of normative expectations attached to us by family, culture, religion, and the rest of the world about us. I think this is one of the reasons why people find Nietzsche quite as exhilarating as he is when we read about the noble soul in Nietzsche, because the noble soul seems like someone who has thrown off the burdens of these normative expectations and is not affected by them, so to speak, right? So there's a sense in which my sense of who I am is something that I need to arrive at in this exquisite balancing act between the fact that I have a history that precedes me, that places me at this particular moment in time, that makes me conceive of myself in a particular way, that places certain burdens upon me. But those burdens are not in some ways ones that should crush me, ones that I should strive to attain in such a way that I'm made anxious by their non-attainment, right? So authenticity is a way of freeing myself from a certain kind of made-up figure, right? I mean, Heidegger calls this Das Man, the kind of stereotypical gray entity that is constructed by society's expectations, right? And anxiety allows me to understand that underneath all of this is this formless, shapeless mass that I am. I need to make of myself in sympathy with the history that precedes me. But in the act of making myself, I'm aware of the fact that there is a freedom and possibility that is open to me that I might not have imagined given my particular historical location earlier. So I would say authenticity is the urge or is the business of establishing a place and a path for ourselves that navigates the anxiety of having to conform to the history that preceded me.
And Kate asks, how can we help each other with anxiety? How should this knowledge about ubiquity of anxiety guide our interaction with others?
Wonderful question. I think it should induce compassion in all of us. We're all anxious. We are all sentient, suffering creatures, as the Buddha would say. And I would say the deepest lesson that anxiety has convinced me of is that we need love, that the fear of the loss of love makes us deeply, deeply anxious. Many of the great religions have arrived at this answer, and we seem to come back to it again and again. We need compassion and love for each other. And I think the deepest thing that anxiety can teach us is the importance of compassion. When I look around me, as hopefully I do more often than not, and I hope all of us do, I hope I see fellow sufferers in the positive sense, those who are subject to the same agonizing conditions of existence as I am. And this should lead me to treat others with kindness and compassion. This is a Buddhist answer. This is the basis of Schopenhauer's systems of ethics, unsurprisingly, because he was influenced by Buddhism. It's the kind of experience that people report on, often on psychedelic experiences, where they say they are filled with a kind of compassion for all those around them, and they find this deeply liberating and fulfilling in some sense. So I think my answer to that is perhaps a glib love each other, or have compassion for our predicaments, for the suffering that all of us are confronted with.